In the silence between heaven and earth, there lived a man who shattered the laws of death itself. What if I told you that hidden within the ancient pages of Scripture lies a story so extraordinary, so impossible by human standards, that it has been whispered about for over 4,000 years? A story that the enemy of our souls desperately wants, buried beneath the noise of this world. His name was Enoch, the seventh from Adam, a man who achieved something that no human being, before or since, has ever accomplished. Something that defies everything we think we know about mortality, about the grave, about the boundaries between this world and the next. While the earth groaned under the weight of violence and wickedness, while humanity forgot their Creator and chased after every form of evil, there walked among them a man whose life was so pleasing to the Almighty that God Himself made a decision that had never been made before in human history. Death was not his destiny. Genesis 5:24 records it with breathtaking simplicity. Enoch walked with God, then he was no more, because God took him away. He was no more. Think about those words. One moment, Enoch was walking the earth with the Creator of the universe as his daily companion. The next moment, he simply vanished. No grave, no funeral, no decay. God reached down and translated him directly into eternity, body and soul, without ever tasting death. But here's what they don't want you to understand. Enoch's translation wasn't a random act of divine favoritism. It was the result of something so profound, so intimate, so transformative that it holds the key to everything we've been searching for in our walk with God. For 300 years, this man walked in daily fellowship with the Almighty. 3 centuries of conversation, revelation, and communion that prepared him for a ministry that would echo through eternity itself. Jude tells us that Enoch prophesied about the very last days we're living in right now. What did God reveal to this man during those sacred walks? What mysteries were unveiled? What prophecies were spoken that are unfolding before our very eyes today? Before we journey deeper into this sacred mystery together, I want to thank every single one of you who has supported this message through Super Thanks. Your generosity means more than you know. You're not just donating, you're helping spread light to others who feel alone in their calling. Whether you give or not, I'm deeply grateful for your presence here, your support, your time, your attention. It all matters. And if this message resonates with your soul, go ahead and plant that seed of faith. Because tonight, we're not just studying ancient history. We're uncovering a blueprint for the kind of relationship with God that transcends death itself. We're discovering what it truly means to walk so closely with the Creator that the very fabric of reality bends around your faith. The question that will haunt you until the very end is this: if one man could walk so intimately with God that death lost its power over him, what is stopping you from walking that same path? The truth about Enoch is about to change everything you thought you knew about your destiny. In the beginning, there was light, and then there was darkness. And in that darkness, blood cried out from the ground. The first murder, Abel's innocent blood soaking into the earth, while his brother Cain's hands trembled with the weight of what he had done. But what the world didn't understand in that moment of unspeakable tragedy was that God was already writing a different story, a story of redemption that would echo through the corridors of eternity itself. Genesis 4:25 whispers to us across the millennia. Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and named him Seth. For God has appointed another seed for me, instead of Abel, whom Cain killed. Appointed. That word should stop you in your tracks. This wasn't just the birth of another child. This was divine intervention. God was lighting a torch in the wilderness of human rebellion, establishing a bloodline that would carry the flame of righteousness through the darkest chapters of human history. From Seth came a lineage unlike any other. These weren't just names written in an ancient book. These were carriers of the sacred fire, guardians of the promise, keepers of the covenant. While Cain's descendants built cities of violence and filled the earth with their corruption, Seth's line became something different entirely. They were the ones who began to call upon the name of the Lord. Can you hear the weight of that phrase? In a world spiraling into godlessness, there remained a remnant who remembered their Creator. Adam, Seth, Enoch, Cainan, Mahalalel, Jared, and then the seventh, 7. God's number of divine completion, 7 days of creation, 7 spirits before the throne, 7 seals, 7 trumpets. The pattern runs like a golden thread through all of Scripture. And here, in the 7th generation from Adam, God was preparing something extraordinary. Enoch, his very name means dedicated or initiated. But dedicated to what? Initiated into what? The sacred genealogy tells us that when Jared was 162 years old, he became the father of this child whose destiny would shatter every assumption about human mortality. Picture this moment. Jared, a man who would live nearly 1,000 years, holding his newborn son, and somehow knowing perhaps by divine whisper, perhaps by prophetic insight, that this child was different. The name he chose wasn't accidental. It was prophetic. This boy would be dedicated to something beyond earthly pursuits, initiated into mysteries that no human had ever experienced. Think about the spiritual atmosphere Enoch was born into. This wasn't a world of peace and righteousness. Genesis tells us that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Violence filled the earth. The descendants of Cain had created a civilization built on human achievement and godless ambition, while the line of Seth held fast to their faith like survivors, clinging to a life raft in a storm. Into this spiritual battlefield, this clash between light and darkness, came the 7th, from Adam, the child who would grow up witnessing the contrast between those who remembered God and those who had forgotten Him entirely. The boy who would learn that there were only 2 paths in this world, the way of Cain that led to death, and the way of Seth that led to life. But here's what will shake you to your core. Enoch wasn't just another righteous man in a long line of faithful fathers. The sacred text is trying to tell us something profound about divine timing, about God's sovereign plan unfolding through the generations. The 7th ripple from Eden wasn't random. It was orchestrated. Enoch wasn't just a man. He was a spiritual turning point in human history, a living demonstration that even in a world consumed by darkness, intimate fellowship with the Creator was still possible. The bloodline that began with Seth's appointment was leading somewhere specific, building towards something unprecedented. The torch had been passed from generation to generation, and now it burned brightest in the hands of one whose very existence would challenge everything the world thought it knew about the boundaries between heaven and earth. But this is only the beginning of a mystery that will leave you questioning everything you thought you understood about walking with God. Comment 7. If you feel there is a pattern God is showing us in the 7th generation. The earth had forgotten how to tremble before God. In the days when Enoch first drew breath, the world was not merely fallen, it was falling still. Every sunrise brought fresh corruption. Every generation descended deeper into darkness. The Creator's voice, which had once walked with man in the cool of the evening, now seemed to echo only in the memory of a few, while the many built altars to themselves. This was not the gentle decline of a civilization losing its way. This was the violent rebellion of creatures who had tasted divinity and chosen to become gods themselves. The descendants of Cain had built the world's first cities monuments to human pride that scraped the heavens with their arrogance. They had mastered the forge, creating weapons that could kill faster, tools that could build higher, instruments that could sing sweeter than angels. Tubal-Cain hammered bronze and iron into implements of war. Jabal domesticated herds to feed ever-growing appetites. Jubal crafted harps and flutes that could move the soul. yet none of their melodies moved them toward their Maker. They had everything except what they needed most: the fear of the Lord. Genesis whispers to us in sacred silence about those days, but the echoes of ancient texts, like Jubilees and the testimony of Enoch himself, paint a more terrifying picture. The earth had become a forest of altars, but every one was built to man, not to the Maker. Violence filled the earth like floodwaters, but this deluge was not of rain, it was of blood. The strong devoured the weak without consequence. The powerful took what they desired without restraint. Might had become right, and right had become extinct. They lived as if death was a distant rumor, as if judgment was a fairy tale told by the fearful, as if the God who had breathed life into Adam's nostrils had simply forgotten about his creation. Sound familiar? Look around you today. A world where truth is negotiable, where children are sacrificed on altars of convenience, where the created mock their creator from stages of gold and silver, where violence streams through our screens like entertainment, where the powerful prey upon the innocent with impunity, where entire nations have legislated God out of their constitutions and their consciences. The technology changes, the rebellion remains the same, but in that ancient world of corruption, something impossible was happening. In the midst of a generation that had forgotten the language of holiness, there walked a man who spoke daily with the divine. While others built towers to their own glory, Enoch built altars to the Most High. While others silenced their consciences with pleasure and power, Enoch tuned his heart to hear the whisper of the Almighty. He was not just different, was dangerous. A living, breathing contradiction to everything his world believed about gods and men, about power and glory, about life and death. The righteous had become so rare that they could be counted on one hand. Noah's grandfather, Methuselah, the line of Seth clinging to the promises of God like survivors clinging to driftwood in a storm. And among them all, one man who would not merely survive the darkness, he would transcend it entirely. Enoch's walk with God began not in a garden of peace, but in a battlefield of souls. Every step he took toward heaven was a step away from hell. Every conversation with the Creator was an act of rebellion against the kingdom of self that ruled his world. But here's the mystery that should shake you to your core. Why did the God who had pronounced the curse of death upon all flesh, why did this same God allow one man just on it to escape that curse entirely? What did Enoch possess that Adam had lost? What did he discover that could transform a mortal man into something that death itself could not touch? The answer lies not just in what Enoch did, but in how closely he learned to walk with the one who holds the keys of death and hell. In the growing darkness of a world that had forgotten its creator, something extraordinary began to stir in the heart of one man. While others chased after the glittering promises of Cain's civilization, while the descendants of Seth grew comfortable in their routines of worship, Enoch felt a pull that he could not name, a hunger that earthly bread could never satisfy. The ancient texts whisper of those early moments when heaven first touched earth through this seventh son of Adam. Picture him in the pre-dawn hours, slipping away from his father's house while the world still slept. Not fleeing from responsibility, but running towards something greater than himself. Each footstep on the dew-covered ground was a prayer, each breath a reaching toward the eternal. God did not speak to crowds in those days. He walked with one man. The sacred silence tells us more than the words themselves. Genesis records that Enoch walked with God, but it doesn't tell us how it began. Was it a voice calling from the wilderness? A dream that wouldn't fade? Or was it simply the recognition that his soul was designed for more than this world could offer? Jewish tradition speaks of Enoch's radical transformation, how he would disappear for days at a time, seeking the face of the Almighty in places where no human footprint had ever fallen. His family watched as this young man grew distant from their concerns, not out of coldness, but out of a burning that consumed everything ordinary within him. And then came the moment that would seal his prophetic destiny. Genesis 5:21 records with stunning brevity, Enoch lived 65 years and begot Methuselah. But hidden within that birth announcement lies one of Scripture's most chilling prophecies. For the name Methuselah means when he dies, it shall come, a walking, breathing countdown to the flood that would destroy the world. Imagine Enoch holding his newborn son, knowing that this child's death would mark humanity's judgment. Every birthday would be a reminder, every milestone, a tick of the cosmic clock. God had given him a son whose very existence declared that time was running out. This was the moment Enoch stepped fully into his calling as heaven's messenger to a doomed generation. No longer just a seeker, but now a prophet carrying the weight of divine revelation. The man who had once walked toward God now discovered something that would shake him to his core. He wasn't seeking heaven, heaven was seeking him. The transformation was complete. The student had become the teacher, the worshiper had become the warning, and the earth would never be the same. But this was only the beginning of a journey that would culminate in something unprecedented in human history, a man so close to God that death itself would lose its claim on him. Pause. Ask yourself, are you walking toward God or just walking? Because what happened next in Enoch's story will reveal the stunning difference between religion and relationship, between knowing about God and walking with Him daily. 300 years of walking with the Almighty had transformed Enoch into something far beyond a mystic or a seeker. God was preparing him for a calling that would shake the foundations of eternity itself. The man who had found perfect communion with his Creator was about to become heaven's messenger to a world rushing headlong toward judgment. In the ancient silence between heaven and earth, God was raising up His first end-time prophet. Picture this moment. Enoch, now seasoned by centuries of divine fellowship, suddenly receives visions that pierce through time itself. What he sees is so staggering, so earth-shattering, that it would be preserved in Scripture for thousands of years. The book of Jude captures one of these revelations with chilling precision. Enoch, the seventh from Adam, prophesied about them. See, the Lord is coming with thousands upon thousands of His holy ones to judge everyone. But here's what will astound you. Enoch wasn't just seeing the flood that would come in Noah's generation. His prophetic vision catapulted him across millennia, beyond every earthly kingdom, beyond every empire that would rise and fall. He was witnessing the final act of human history, the return of the Lord Jesus Christ with His glorified saints. Before Moses ever climbed Mount Sinai, before Isaiah saw the Lord high and lifted up, before Ezekiel beheld the wheels within wheels, there was Enoch, standing at the threshold of eternity, watching the end unfold with prophetic clarity. The ancient Jewish traditions tell us that during these divine encounters, Enoch was shown the cosmic courtroom where God would judge all ungodliness. He saw multitudes of holy ones, translated saints, martyred believers, the redeemed of all ages, returning with Christ as His heavenly army. This wasn't metaphor. This was literal, terrifying, magnificent reality. Can you imagine the weight of carrying such a vision? Enoch had to return to his everyday world, a world consumed with building, buying, marrying, and merrymaking, knowing that he had seen their ultimate end. He had witnessed the day when every ungodly deed would be exposed, when every harsh word spoken against the Almighty would be answered, when the patience of God would reach its divine limit. This is why his contemporaries rejected him. Enoch's message wasn't just uncomfortable, it was impossible to ignore. He wasn't speaking from human wisdom or religious speculation. He was delivering direct revelation from the throne room of God. Every word he spoke carried the weight of eternity because he had literally seen eternity. The book of Enoch, treasured by ancient believers, reveals even more staggering details of what this prophet witnessed. He saw the fallen angels bound in chains of darkness. He observed the place prepared for the righteous and the fate awaiting the wicked. He beheld the very throne of God, surrounded by creatures whose glory would blind mortal eyes. But here's the mystery that should shake every believer to their core. What exactly did Enoch see during those divine encounters that made God declare, "You cannot die like other men"? What revelation was so sacred, so essential for the end times, that death itself had to be suspended? The answer lies in understanding that Enoch wasn't just a prophet. He was a living bridge between two worlds. His translation wasn't just reward for faithfulness. It was preparation for a ministry that extends far beyond his earthly life. Even now, somewhere in the courts of heaven, Enoch continues as a witness to what he saw, a keeper of mysteries that will unfold in the last days. Before there was Moses, before there was Elijah, there was Enoch, the first to see the end, and what he saw should change everything about how we live today. Because the vision he received over 4,000 years ago is about to become our reality. Comment, return, if you believe the Lord is coming back with his holy ones, just like Enoch saw. But the deeper we journey into Enoch's extraordinary life, the more we discover that his walks with God were leading him into territories that would shake the very foundations of heaven and earth. What God was about to reveal to this seventh son of Adam would expose a cosmic war that had been raging since before the flood, a war between heaven's rebels and the throne of the Most High. In the forbidden pages of the book of Enoch, we find revelations so staggering, so apocalyptic, that they were considered too dangerous for most believers to handle. These weren't mere visions or dreams. These were journeys into the very courtroom of heaven itself, where Enoch would witness the judgment of beings so powerful, so corrupted, that their rebellion had poisoned the bloodline of humanity. It began with the Watchers, 200 mighty angels, sons of God, who had been stationed to watch over the earth and guard mankind. But watching turned to lusting, guarding turned to coveting, and in a moment that would echo through every generation, these heavenly beings made a pact that would damn them forever. "Come," they whispered to one another, "let us choose wives from among the daughters of men and beget children for ourselves." Their leader was Azazel. Their oath was sworn upon Mount Hermon, and their descent to earth marked the beginning of humanity's darkest chapter. These Watchers didn't just take human wives. They violated the very order of creation itself. They taught forbidden knowledge to mankind, the secrets of metallurgy for weapons of war, the arts of cosmetics and jewelry that inflamed vanity, the mysteries of astrology that turned hearts from the Creator to the creation. They gave humanity knowledge that God had intentionally withheld, knowledge that would corrupt and destroy rather than bless and build. But the most horrifying consequence of their rebellion was what emerged from their unholy unions, the Nephilim. Giants, beings of such monstrous size and appetite that they consumed everything in their path. When the food of earth could no longer satisfy them, they turned to consuming men. When men could no longer feed them, they turned to consuming one another. The earth became a slaughterhouse. Blood cried out from every corner of creation. And in the midst of this cosmic horror, God looked down from heaven and saw Enoch faithful, walking, interceding. Enoch chose him to bear witness to divine justice. What happened next defies every boundary between earth and heaven. God didn't just speak to Enoch about these fallen angels. He transported him into the very presence of these chained rebels. The book of Enoch describes chambers beneath the earth, where these Watchers were bound in chains of darkness, awaiting their final judgment. Enoch walked among beings who had once stood before the throne of God, now weeping in their eternal prison. But here's where the story becomes even more extraordinary. These fallen angels, recognizing Enoch's unique relationship with the Almighty, begged him to intercede for them. They pleaded with this mortal man to carry their petition for mercy before the throne of God. Picture this scene. Angelic beings who had once commanded legions of heaven, now prostrating themselves before a man, begging him to speak to God on their behalf. Enoch agreed. He carried their petition into the very presence of the Most High. But God's response was swift and terrible. "You have no peace. There will be upon you a harsh sentence to judge you. They will not obtain mercy." The Watcher's fate was sealed, but Enoch's role as heaven's messenger was just beginning. In vision after vision, God revealed to Enoch the cosmic scope of this rebellion. He showed him how the corruption of the Watchers had infected not just the physical world, but the spiritual realm itself. He revealed the genealogies of the giants, the extent of their destruction, and the coming flood that would cleanse the earth of their pollution. But most remarkably, God showed Enoch the future. He saw the final judgment, when these same rebellious forces would be cast into the lake of fire. He witnessed the resurrection of the righteous and the establishment of God's eternal kingdom. Enoch wasn't just walking with God. He was walking through heaven's secrets, carrying messages between the divine court and fallen creation, serving as heaven's ambassador to a world spinning toward judgment. The weight of these revelations transformed Enoch from a man who simply pleased God into a cosmic figure standing at the intersection of divine justice and human destiny. This is why his translation was inevitable. How could a man who had witnessed such cosmic mysteries, who had carried heaven's messages, who had stood in the presence of both the Most High and the Most Fallen, how could such a man simply die like other mortals? Should we unveil even deeper mysteries from the book of Enoch, the seven heavens, the throne room of God, the prophetic scrolls of judgment? Type Watchers if you're ready to journey further into these forbidden revelations. For 300 years, 3 centuries, longer than America has existed as a nation, Enoch walked with God. Not once a week, not during the holy seasons, every single day. Genesis 5:22 whispers this impossible truth with sacred simplicity. After he begot Methuselah, Enoch walked with God 300 years. But what the scripture doesn't tell us haunts the silence between those ancient words. What does 300 years of daily conversation with the creator of the universe actually look like? Picture this. Each morning, as the sun painted the ancient world with its first light, Enoch would step outside his dwelling. And there, waiting for him, like the most faithful friend who ever lived, was the Lord of all creation, not in vision, not in dream, but present, walking, talking, sharing the day ahead. Can you imagine the questions Enoch must have asked? Father, why did you make the stars sing? How do you hold the oceans in your palm? What were you thinking when you breathed life into Adam's nostrils? And God, the infinite, eternal, all-knowing God, delighted in every question, answered with the patience of perfect love, walked slower so Enoch could keep up. 300 years of laughter, echoing through ancient valleys. 300 years of tears shared over humanity's growing rebellion. 300 years of wonder as God revealed mysteries that no university, no philosopher, no scientist would discover for millennia. While the world around them built cities and forged weapons, while civilization advanced and moral darkness deepened, 2 friends walked together, never growing tired of each other's company, never running out of things to discuss, never feeling the awkward silence that even the closest human relationships sometimes experience. In our age of crushing loneliness, where people are more connected yet more isolated than ever before, Enoch's story becomes a sword that pierces the heart. Here was communion so pure, so intimate, so complete that the boundary between earth and heaven began to dissolve. God didn't send angels with messages. He didn't speak through burning bushes or prophetic visions. He simply walked. Think about your closest friend. Now imagine never having a misunderstanding, never growing apart, never disappointing each other. Imagine conversations that lasted for hours without a single moment of boredom. Imagine sharing thoughts so deep that your very soul felt understood. That was Enoch's daily reality for 3 centuries. As the years accumulated, 50 years, 100 years, 200 years, something beautiful and inevitable began happening. Enoch's heart started beating in rhythm with heaven's pulse. His thoughts began mirroring God's thoughts. His concerns became God's concerns. Heaven had become more familiar to Enoch than earth. The man who walked with God daily for 300 years was no longer fully of this world. He was becoming something else, something between mortal and eternal, something that even death itself couldn't quite claim. Comment 300 if you want that kind of unbroken communion with the Creator, who is still waiting to walk with those who seek His face with all their heart. 300 years of walking with the Almighty had prepared Enoch for this moment, though he could never have imagined what was about to unfold. It began like any other day. The sun rose over the ancient world, casting its golden light across valleys where Cain's descendants built their cities of violence, and hills where Seth's lineage still called upon the name of the Lord. Enoch, now 365 years old, prepared for what he believed would be another sacred walk with his Creator. But this day would shatter every law of human existence. Genesis 5:24 records the moment with breathtaking simplicity. Enoch walked with God. Then he was no more. Because God took him, he was no more. Picture that moment. One instant, Enoch was walking the familiar paths of earth, perhaps discussing with God the growing darkness in the world, the approaching judgment his son's name foretold. The next instant, silence. Not the silence of death, but the silence of translation. The silence of a man stepping from one realm into another without ever feeling the cold touch of the grave. There was no farewell speech, no dramatic goodbye to his family, no final prophecy delivered to the crowds who had gathered to hear him preach. One moment he was there, and then he simply wasn't. Imagine his family waiting for him to return home that evening. The sun setting, shadows lengthening, but no Enoch walking through their door. Hours turning to days, days to weeks. Search parties combing every valley, every mountain, every place he was known to walk. But there was no body to find, no trace of violence, no evidence of accident or disease. Enoch had simply vanished. The writer of Hebrews reveals the mystery. By faith, Enoch was taken from this life, so that he did not experience death. He could not be found, because God had taken him away. For before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God. He pleased God. In a world drowning in wickedness, where violence filled the earth and every imagination of man's heart was only evil continually, one man pleased the Creator so completely that death itself was denied its claim. This wasn't resurrection. That would come later through another man who would conquer death forever. This was translation. This was God reaching down and saying, This one has walked so closely with me that I cannot bear our fellowship to be interrupted, even temporarily." Death came looking for Enoch that day, but heaven arrived first. The implications cascade through eternity. If one man could walk so intimately with God that the very laws of mortality bent around his faith, what does that say about the kind of relationship the Creator desires with each of us? What depths of communion are possible when a human heart surrenders completely to divine love? The ancient rabbis whispered that Enoch had become so much like God in character that his physical form could no longer contain the glory. The early church fathers saw in his translation a preview of our own resurrection hope. The mystics believed he had crossed a threshold that few even dare to imagine. But perhaps the most haunting question remains: why Enoch? And in these last days, as darkness once again covers the earth, could it happen again? The next generation of Enoch-like believers may be rising even now, learning to walk with God in such intimacy that heaven begins to blur with earth. If you believe you're called to that kind of walk, if you sense that same ancient hunger stirring in your soul, type "I walk with God" in the comments below. Because what happened to Enoch wasn't just history, it was prophecy, a preview of what awaits those who choose to walk not just toward God, but with Him, in the sacred intimacy that transforms mortals into citizens of eternity. The man who pleased God had shown the way home. Part 8. The Echo in Prophecy. Enoch's warning to the last generation. The footsteps that echoed through antediluvian valleys still reverberate today. When Jude lifted his pen to write those haunting words about Enoch's prophecy, he wasn't recording ancient history. He was unveiling a divine spotlight that pierces through millennia to illuminate our generation with startling precision. Behold, the Lord comes with 10,000s of His saints to execute judgment on all. Listen carefully to what Enoch saw in his prophetic vision. Not just the violence of his own day, but a generation that would arise in the last days, a generation drunk on self-worship, intoxicated by their own wisdom, mocking the very idea of divine accountability. Sound familiar? Enoch foresaw a time when men would become lovers of themselves rather than lovers of God, when truth would be trampled underfoot by those who speak great swelling words while their hearts remain far from their Creator. He witnessed a generation that would call evil good and good evil, that would celebrate what God abhors and despise what He cherishes. The ancient prophet saw our smartphones glowing like false gods in darkened rooms. He witnessed our endless pursuit of pleasure while the King of Glory stands at the door, knocking. He watched as humanity would build towers of technology and pride, forgetting the one who gave them breath. But here's what should make every believer's heart race with holy urgency. Enoch's prophecy wasn't just about judgment, it was about timing. The very characteristics he described in the ungodly weren't meant for his generation, they were meant for ours. The footsteps of the Almighty that Enoch once heard on earthly paths are now approaching from heavenly realms. Enoch was a man ahead of time, and now, time has caught up. The translation that removed him from a wicked world was a prévious divine rehearsal for what's coming when the Lord returns with 10,000s of His saints. Are you ready for the footsteps you cannot yet hear? Tag someone who needs to hear this. Someone asleep while the King approaches. Because the echo Enoch left behind is becoming a roar. But here's where Enoch's story becomes more than ancient history. It becomes prophecy unfolding before our very eyes. What if I told you that Enoch wasn't just translated to heaven as a unique reward for his faithfulness? What if his disappearance was actually God's preview, a divine blueprint for what He plans to do again in the last days? The Apostle Paul, writing under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, gives us a glimpse into this mystery in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. Then we who are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. Caught up, translated, taken away without seeing death. The same Greek word Paul uses here, harpazo, carries the same meaning as what happened to Enoch, a sudden supernatural removal from earth to heaven. God didn't just take Enoch as a one-time miracle. He was establishing a pattern, a prototype of what awaits those who walk intimately with Him in the final generation. Think about it. Enoch lived in the days before the flood, when violence filled the earth and every imagination of man's heart was only evil continually. Does that sound familiar? He was a righteous man living in the midst of unprecedented wickedness, walking so closely with God that the corruption around him couldn't touch him. As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. Enoch represents the end-time believer, set apart from this world's system, intimate with the Father, fearless in evil days, prophetically aware of what's coming. He shows us that translation isn't escape, it's invitation. An invitation into the very presence of God for those who have learned to walk with Him daily, just as Enoch did. The first to rise without dying, and the last shall follow. The story of Enoch is not over. It's happening again. God is raising up Enoch-like believers in these final days. Men and women who refuse to be conformed to this world, who walk in daily communion with their Creator, who understand that their citizenship is not here but in heaven. If you believe God is preparing His people for translation in these last days, if you sense His call to walk as Enoch walked, type "I am ready" below.